As South Africa commemorates the annual 16 Days of Activism against gender-based violence, University of Stellenbosch Business School senior lecturer Dr Nthabiseng Moleko says the question is not whether the country has sufficient resources to deal with violence against women and children, but whether these resources are being sufficiently directed. Crime statistics for the first quarter of 2021 show that the contact crimes, which reflect gender-based violence, have increased by more than 60% compared to the same period in 2020. Dr Moleko joins us now. Dr Moleko, good morning. Those figures, heart-wrenching, an increase of 60%.
The reality is the numbers are telling us the situation on the ground, and it's unfortunate that we have such a prevalent amount of violence in our society. But historically, if you look at numbers and the type of violent crimes, it's staggering, Hugo. And I think that the numbers point us to the problem of the root cause not necessarily being dealt with. Are we sufficiently looking at primarily the predisposed issues that are risk factors in our society? And I think that's what we need to point to. Also with the justice cluster and the policing and the post effect, which is critical in corrective measures. But I think the prevention is really what we need to put more of our efforts in.
Obviously, we seem to be missing the point in that when it comes to corrective or preventative measures, there seems to be a significant effort in that regard. But you talked about the causal factors. I mean, what are those factors?
Well, there's a lot of research that's been done for South African men. There's a study both by Sonke Gender Justice, also by the Institute of Security Studies, which cites 74 literature reviews looking at the scope of violence occurring across the landscape, whether it's violence against women and children, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and the like. And what they've found in both these studies is that the issue of men who are predisposed to trauma, men who themselves grew up with such violence, mental issues, and particularly the issue of drinking or substance abuse correlated to increased and heightened violence against women and children, are some of the factors and risk factors that predispose South Africans to this type of outcome. We don't necessarily see sufficient programs that deal with childhood victimization, molestation, and trauma that many of the perpetrators simply continue to do because it was done to themselves. And I think similar to what we have with the Narcotics Anonymous, Alcohol Anonymous, what do we have that enables men who have this type of a problem? Because it's quite prevalent. If you look at the sexual offenses occurrences of the statistics of rape in South Africa, which are the highest in the world, and the statistics of sexual violence, which are 1 in 5 for every woman, but also 1 in 3 if you have a low socioeconomic background, you see that this is very, very high incidence of sexual violence. That means in every society you have men who are suffering this type of behavior. And the question is, what are we doing to encourage interventions that not only prevent, but also change the behavior and the norms of these perpetrators?
Surely South African men or South African children, which is where it starts, are not the only ones that are predisposed or that are exposed to these challenges in how they're raised, coming up from broken homes, for instance, and some of the things that you talked about. Other countries, I'm sure, is similar. But why the violence? Why so much violence in South Africa?
Well, I think we come from a history of a very violent society, unfortunately. And there is no doubt that South Africa's state-sanctioned violence has had a devastating effect on our modus operandi as people. We also have a high level of community violence where society takes matters into their own hands when they believe I'd say the social justice cluster or the social cluster isn't taking matters decisively. We've seen a lot of these mob-type killings where communities take matters into their own hands. I think the issue of fatherlessness we haven't dealt with sufficiently in South Africa. There are various statistics that show us 6 out of 10 from statistics they say are born in single-child households. What is the effect of this in households on young men and girl children? What is the effect of this on society as a whole? So now, what we are dealing with, if you look at now budgets and you look at type of programs and response services, the majority of our funding, there's a lot of money that is allocated towards policing, the social cluster, over 157 billion, but less than a tenth of that is actually towards prevention. So we're always dealing with the response after the fact. We're always dealing ex post, I'd call it. And really, our interventions are not targeted at trying to deal with norms and values at a childhood level. And I like the point that you make about children. For an example, they normally get lost in the process because domestic violence is usually on the mother or the partner, and the protection order process happens. But there is a child who was watching. In some families, in some instances, there is a child who was victimized. What happens to that child? Are there social services that ensure that this child is actually receiving adequate support, adequate victimization support, so that they themselves don't repeat this process in an intergenerational type of a system, which is normally what we see. So I think that we've got to have transformative processes, both informally and formally. And I think that we do have the infrastructure in South Africa. But I guess whether or not we're looking at the efficacy of our programs right now. As you say, we're closing 16 days, I think, on Monday. But the question is, how effective are these campaigns that we have annually? Do they lead to results? Are they yielding the type of outcomes that we want to see? And I think we really have to ask ourselves the hard questions as to say, what is the efficacy of our programs? Should we not reconfigure some of our programs and look at more effective and evidence-based outcomes that will really strengthen our outcomes in terms of reducing violence against particularly women and children?
Well, Dr. Moleko, I don't even think that question is worth asking when we talk about an increase of 60% in GBV cases in the last 12 months, if you will. But my question then is, what is a role, or what role can schools play in dealing with this? Because my take is that numerous campaigns that we can carry out may not reach the targeted audience. But one of the most commonplace areas where all of us have gone through or will go through is the school or the education system.
Yes, I love that question. What can schools be doing? So we've not necessarily used schools as points of interventions for necessarily violence against women and children and reducing the incidents. We've also not necessarily looked at how we can deal with the issue of trauma, because a lot of the children in schools who suffer trauma are likely to, I'd say, show this trauma to other scholars, or this be indicative of their behavior towards their teachers or to their fellow schoolmates. And you see this manifesting in their behavior, probably in how they treat children and other learners and teachers on site. I think the first thing is that let's look at schools as sites of intervention. I think the first is that we should teach our children consent. I think that looking at understanding what is a sexual crime. Many learners don't even understand what is consent. We've got to teach our learners what is sexual consent. Adults don't even seem to understand sexual consent. I think the issue of objectification of women, teaching our learners at a young level that what is true respect, from teenagers to universities, you find that objectification of women is a norm, and they grow up in a culture where very derogatory terms are a norm. You must win women. If you have a lot of women, you are the man. So this type of toxic masculinity that has become a norm, we can unwind this by teaching, certain values at a high school going level. But I think more importantly, the dilemma of fatherlessness in our society, which we don't touch mostly on, we simply look at the statistics and leave it at that. But how does this form the male identity? How does this affect the identity of a man? And I think that it's important for us, and beyond schooling, looking at the civil society, social programs that are maybe in churches and other type of institutions of faith-based organizations, which can help support offer mentorship and foster care, particularly where there is no male figure in a family. And I think these are critical for us if we are trying to rewire how our society's outcomes in relation to this are. And I think the last point, Hugo, that I want to make, we've got to look at the issue of trauma. Healing is needed. So if young men have been violated, or a young person has been molested, or is predisposed to domestic violence in the home, and the mother is staying in that situation, there should be interventions to deal with that trauma, that type of dialogue with the learner. And I don't think we have those type of spaces. We rather wait for them to be 18, 19, and they're now a problem child, and we're dealing with the after effect of maybe some of the violence that they are now inflicting on others. And I think we've got to program and look at these issues. And these studies have shown what are successful programs, what programs actually work, how the design should be, how they look at intimate partner violence. And I think that we have a framework of how to discuss these issues, what I'd say effective programs look like, and an in-depth understanding on how to change the behavior of a potential perpetrator. Let's not wait for our young people to become perpetrators because they were victims. Let's turn that tide and change them before they themselves become perpetrators.
Well, very quickly, Doctor, talk to us about that process of rewiring. How do we get that abuser or that perpetrator who's a 30-year-old, 40-year-old man to change his behavior?
Well, I think the first thing, you have to have a place where they can go to talk. So if I'm telling you now, and you are a male who's 30, 20, even in your teens, and you have a problem of, for an example, violence, you're angry, where do you get help, right? The first place is there's got to be very clear points of call, points of contact where you can get help. And I talk the same for victims. There's got to be very clear points of call where you can receive help. Now, we know that for the side of the victim, there is what we call Tutuzela care centers. We also know that there are shelters where women can go, and even men for that matter, who are violated. But on the side of the perpetrators, it's not clear what is that pathway of receiving help. That's the first. The second, I think that there has to be guidance in terms of effective counseling. So you have to have the whole social services cluster. I think even at a schooling level, even looking at this, what we call formal versus informal programs. So at a community level, we know that from the court mediation process, many of the court cases for domestic violence sometimes are mediated upon prosecution. And this happens through social services. And I think we have to massify this so that we don't necessarily wait for court outcomes, because then it becomes a mandatory. You can actually do this before someone reaches a court case or protection order, but rather when you see that there is a problem and you refer them. So there has to be clear referral pathways. I think thirdly, there are programs that can be designed by psychologists and equivalent, whereby, and this is the question you asked me, you go beyond dialogue. So many of our programs that are in the community right now about male mobilization, awareness campaigns. So you've got to go a little step further after mobilization and awareness campaigns. You've got to deal with the issue of interventions around how objectification of women is dealt with, the agency of women, power relations, and understanding consent. I think the other issue that is difficult for men to understand is how they themselves perpetrate violence and how to change these behaviors. And these are programs that are studied in the 74 papers and journals, which are articulated towards, some are strong in terms of outcomes, some are weak, some are moderate. So you're able to see which have the most impact. And I think that we could use that as a framework to say, how can we better design these programs to provide a change in norms and values? And I think that there is a framework for us to work from.
Dr Nthabiseng Moleko is a Senior Lecturer in Managerial Economics and Statistics at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. And that conversation around how fatherlessness, amongst other things, is a huge contributor to the rate of GBV that we're experiencing in the country.